Charles Manson, the serial killer who terrified America. Charles Manson is considered one of the most notorious serial killers who terrorized the United States, born on November 12, 1930, and dying on November 19, 2017, at the age of 83. His story remains one of the most infamous in American history. Manson had a history of manipulative behavior, mental illness, including schizophrenia and delusional paranoia, and control over others that has fascinated and horrified people for decades. Throughout history, many serial killers have been remembered for their gruesome acts and brutal crimes, but few have possessed the charisma and influence of Charles Manson. Manson, the founder and leader of the cult known as the Manson family, successfully convinced his followers to commit a series of murder under the belief that their actions would accelerate the outbreak of a race war that could happen at any moment. Among his victims was actress Sharon Tate, who was also the wife of famed filmmaker Roman Polanski. Despite Manson's imprisonment, he continued to have a large following even after his arrest. His influence extended so far that the artist Marilyn Manson chose his stage name as a combination of Marilyn Monroe and Charles Manson. Manson was born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio, to a 17-year-old mother. He had a troubled childhood, with his alcoholic mother being imprisoned for robbing a gas station. After her release on probation, Manson and his mother lived in abandoned homes until he was placed in a Catholic-run care facility. However, he escaped after just 10 months. According to Manson himself, his mother once traded him to a waitress in exchange for a beer she couldn't afford. His uncle later retrieved him a few days later. Both Manson's mother and his brother had criminal records and were sentenced to 5 years in prison for robbing a gas station in Charleston, West Virginia in 1939. This led Manson to spend time in a home for homeless children. Later, when he tried to return home, his mother rejected him. Manson began committing crimes at a very young age, first being arrested at 13 for robbing a grocery store. Despite his intelligence, he escaped reform school just 4 days after being sent there. After several arrests and escapes from reform schools for stealing cars, Manson returned to prison in 1967 for check fraud. While in prison, Manson studied mysticism and Eastern philosophy. By that time, he had been married and divorced twice, fathering 2 children with 2 different women. After being released from prison in 1967, Manson moved to San Francisco, living as a drifter until he met Mary Bruner, a 23-year-old library assistant at the University of California, Berkeley. Manson's ability to charm and manipulate others was so strong that he soon moved in with her. His charisma earned him the nickname the Wizard among his admirers. A few months later, Bruner and Manson were sharing an apartment with 18 of his female followers and lovers. At the time, San Francisco was a hub for the hippie movement, and Manson quickly established himself as a spiritual guru. Thanks to his persuasive abilities, he soon had his first group of followers, who would later be known as the Manson family. It is worth noting that most of these followers were women. That same year, Brunner became pregnant with Manson's third child. In the following year, Manson established his hideout at the Spahn Ranch in California's Valley. The Manson family didn't pay rent, as Manson ordered his followers to have intimate relations with the nearly blind owner in exchange for rent-free living. With many loyal followers willing to sacrifice for him, Manson began plotting to expand his influence, control, and spread his unique ideology and philosophy. The story of Charles Manson began to take a dramatic turn. The Manson family included individuals who were mostly educated and from middle class and even wealthy backgrounds. Yet they committed numerous murders at Manson's command. Although Manson never physically committed these murders, his ideas were the driving force behind the family's decision to take lives. Manson believed that a racial war was imminent, an idea he interpreted from the Beatles' song Helter Skelter. This was both the title of the song and its supposed prophecy. Manson believed that Black people would rise up against white people and win the battle. However, since he considered Black people inferior, he believed they wouldn't be able to maintain power, and Manson would then become the leader of the world. As time passed, Manson grew impatient, seeing that Black people were gaining influence in society. He decided to ignite the racial war himself by orchestrating a series of horrific crimes. These crimes left evidence meant to incriminate the Black Panther movement, a Black civil rights organization that had risen after the assassination of Malcolm X. The most notable murder committed by the Manson family was that of actress and model Sharon Tate, who was 26 years old and pregnant at the time. She was only 2 weeks away from giving birth to her child with filmmaker Roman Polanski. That fateful night, while Polanski was in London filming, Tate was at her home having dinner with friends when 4 of Manson's followers stormed the house and carried out a brutal massacre. The murderers were Charles Tex Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, and Linda Kasabian. Just a few months earlier, another Manson family member, Bobby Beausoleil, had murdered musician Gary Hinman after trying to force him to give up an inheritance. The cult members wrote "Political Piggy" in the victim's blood and drew a panther's claw, the symbol of the Black Panther movement, to implicate them in the crime. Beausoleil was arrested months later, prompting Manson to tell the family that it was time to act. Although the exact motive remains unclear, It appears Manson ordered the murder of music producer Terry Melcher, whom Manson had met through a brief association with a member of the Beach Boys. Manson sought to prove his musical talent, but Melcher refused to give him the opportunity. The four killers went to Melcher's former residence, not knowing he no longer lived there. Instead, it was now the home of Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate. Tate and her friends were brutally murdered. Tragically, Sharon Tate pleaded for the life of her unborn child, but Susan Atkins repeatedly stabbed her, later writing "pig" on the door in Tate's blood. The Manson family carried out another vicious attack the following day at the home of the LaBianca couple in Los Angeles. Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were bound by Manson himself, then killed by Leslie Van Houten, who acted on orders to prove her loyalty. The deadly mix of drugs, violence, and unchecked power left an indelible mark on Hollywood's history, with the murder of Sharon Tate and her companions among the most shocking events. In total, the Manson family's killing spree claimed 7 lives in 2 days. Charles Manson's story and his cult caused widespread controversy in American society, especially after the gruesome murders they committed. Months later, Manson and several of his followers were arrested for auto theft. One of them, Susan Atkins, confessed to her cellmates that auto theft was not the worst crime she had committed, prompting authorities to connect the group to the murders. On January 25, 1901, Manson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten were convicted of the murders that occurred on August 8th and 9th. Later that year, Watson was also convicted of the Tate House murders, and Manson was additionally convicted of the murders of Gary Hinman and Donald Shorty Shea, who had been killed at Spahn Ranch in late August 1969. Although the Manson family had fallen, fascination and intrigue around their heinous crimes persisted for 50 years. Manson himself did not physically commit any of the murders, but he was tried as the mastermind behind them and was sentenced to death in 1971. This sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment in 1972. The primary perpetrators were also sentenced to life in prison. Most of them would later claim they were under the influence of drugs during the murders and expressed regret, something Manson never did. He died in November 2017 at the age of 83 from colon cancer and heart failure. Despite the numerous books, documentaries, and films inspired by those 2 nights of violence in a hot August, Manson took the true reason for the murders with him to his grave.